So this is on the physiology of circulation, on the mechanisms of blood flow through the circulatory system, through the veins and arteries, capillaries. So we're going to start out by defining blood flow. Now, blood flow through the systemic circulation is equal to cardiac output. It's the volume of blood flowing through a given place per minute. So cardiac output is the amount of blood that flows out of the heart per minute, or through the heart per minute. And so if we say that everywhere that the blood goes, systemic circulation, the blood flow in systemic circulation has to equal the blood flow of through the heart. So that's cardiac output. However, we can also talk about blood flow through the spleen, or blood flow through the kidneys, or through the lower limb, or something like that. It may not be cardiac output. Now, at rest, when you're not using the tissues, then blood flow is fairly constant. But blood flow changes dramatically with the use. So for instance, the blood flow through the muscles of your gluteal region when you're watching TV or playing Xbox or something is fairly low and is constant. But when you get on a Stairmaster, the amount of blood flow to those muscles goes way, way up. Blood pressure, which is something that as nurses you will be spending a lot of time dealing with, is really a measure of the force exerted on the walls of the blood vessel by the blood that's in that blood vessel. The unit is millimeters of mercury. Most pressure is measured in mmHg, millimeters of mercury. It goes back to the old way of doing it, and you probably have seen wall-mounted sphygmomanometers that actually have a column of mercury, and the pressure pushes the mercury up. It's really basically pressure versus gravity thing. It's the blood pressure that actually keeps the blood moving. What drives blood through the circulatory system is delta P. It's the difference in pressure between a high pressure area and a lower pressure area. The greater the delta P, the more the blood flow. Resistance is opposition to the flow. So again, we talked about this a number of times in class. I will reiterate it. So resistance is inversely proportional to flow. So flow goes down when resistance goes up. And most resistance in terms of blood flow is in terms of friction. So anything that's going to increase the friction is going to increase the resistance and therefore decrease the flow. And there are three sources of resistance. And instinctively you should know them from experience in other things, but it's blood viscosity, so how thick is and sticky is the liquid being forced through the pipe, the total length of the pipe, and the diameter of the pipe. Each of these things contributes to resistance, which opposes flow. Viscosity, think of it in terms of sucking a beverage up a straw. So a milkshake is much harder to move up the straw than a soft drink. the length of the straw that you're sucking up matters. So if the straw is fairly short and pushed deep down into the beverage, it's easier to suck it up the straw. And the total diameter. If you've ever tried to drink a milkshake through a narrow straw, you know that it's very difficult. That's why at Max, if you go for the Slurpees, they have those great big straws, because what that does is it lowers the resistance, because the viscosity of what you're trying to move through it is high, so it counterbalances. So for the most part, on a minute-to-minute basis, blood viscosity doesn't change very much. And blood viscosity is really how many red blood cells, white blood cells, platelets, and proteins there are in it, relatively speaking. So you can increase viscosity by either adding more proteins or formed elements, or by taking away liquid. So as people dehydrate, their blood viscosity goes up, and so when the blood viscosity goes up, so does the resistance, which means flow lessens. In order to maintain a flow, therefore, blood pressure has to increase. People that have diseases like polycythemia, or abnormalities with blood, this viscosity can change over normal, and it will manifest as changes in blood pressure and changes in flow. Sometimes athletes, in order to carry more oxygen so that they can create more ATP during their event, especially the endurance athletes, will do something called blood doping, where they harvest their own red blood cells. They take blood and they centrifuge out the plasma, and they keep the red blood cells, and then they re-inject those red blood cells back into their bloodstream, so that they have a higher hematocrit and more ability to carry oxygen. Lance Armstrong was recently accused and I think convicted of doing this. The problem with that is you can carry more oxygen, but viscosity goes way up, so therefore blood pressure has to go up to counteract it. Blood vessel length, again, doesn't change very much in the short term, but it changes dramatically in the midterm and the long term. So the longer the blood vessel, the greater the resistance, which makes sense. Like there's just more friction because there's more walls of the blood vessel. If you gain weight, you have to grow more blood vessels to feed that new tissue, that extra tissue. And so resistance will go up, which means that flow either goes down or blood pressure has to go up equivalent to maintain the blood flow, to overcome the resistance. And that's why one of the best ways to lower your blood pressure is to lose weight. That's having less length of blood vessel and trying to create less resistance. It's a very common thing to tell people with high blood pressure that they have to lose weight. It's a very common thing for people that are obese to have high blood pressure because of this factor. The resistance factor that matters minute to minute and changes very dramatically, very quickly, is the size of the lumen, and it has a very dramatic effect because of the physics of it, and for various reasons that I won't go into. The way that it works is resistance varies inversely to the fourth power of the radius of the vessel. What this is saying is basically if you double the size of the blood vessel, so the lumen becomes twice as large, the resistance drops to the fourth power, which is 2 times 2 times 2 times 2, or 16. So that means that a blood vessel that vasoconstricts to half its size has 16 times more resistance, so 16 times less flow at the same pressure. If the number is a third, so if 2/3 of the lumen are blocked and only 1/3 of the lumen is left, then it's 3 times 3 times 3 times 3, which is 81 times the resistance, which is dramatically higher than 16 times the resistance. I always get a kick out of it when people tell me that they have some blockages in the coronary arteries. They go for tests and they've been having some angina or something, and they'll say one of the arteries is 90% blocked, but the other ones are okay. They're not too bad. They're only 75% blocked, or 60% blocked. Well, 60% blockage means that it takes 81 times more force to move the blood to that part of the heart. A 90% blockage is 10 times 10, which is 100, times 10, which is 1,000, times 10, which is 10,000. So a 90% blockage is 10,000 times more resistance. There's 10,000 times less flow at the same pressure. So as you can see, that these are dramatic changes, and it is an interesting thing that means that that small changes in blood vessel diameter can have profound effects on the amount of flow. An interesting thing happens. You can see it sometimes in home construction. Standard plumbing pipes in a home are 1/2-inch diameter tubing, and the flow through them has to go to all the parts of the house. I personally, and when I had my house built, had them upgrade from 1/2-inch to 3/4-inch diameter pipes, which is 1.5 times the diameter. So resistance is 5 times less in the plumbing in my house, which means that I have 5 times more flow of water available to the various things that take water. So what it means is that you can flush a toilet while somebody's in the shower, and it's not going to affect the flow in the shower, because there's 5 times less resistance in a 3/4-inch diameter pipe than in a 1/2-inch pipe. It's just a practical application of that. You'll see that a lot of people, when they put in underground sprinkler systems, you're way better off having a 1-inch pipe to do it, because there's way more flow. You can water more of the lawn at a given pressure. So the small diameter arterioles are the major determinants of this peripheral resistance, and really, in a healthy point of view, it is vasoconstriction and vasodilation that determines how much flow goes to each and every organ. In terms of pathologies, anything that can change this or disrupt it, like plaques, atherosclerosis, clots, etc., can have abrupt and dramatic changes again. So like in terms of angina in the coronary artery atherosclerosis in the coronary arteries, can really affect the amount of flow that gets to the myocardium. So this is really that formula that I put on the board before. Remember I said that the amount of milkshake equals delta suck over straw? This is the same thing. The amount of flow, the amount of blood flow in each area is directly related to the delta P, the difference in pressure from two areas, and over the resistance. So if resistance increases, blood flow decreases. And to compensate, what we're trying to do in physiologically, homeostatically, we try and maintain the flow however we can. And if resistance goes up, then pressure has to go up correspondingly to maintain that flow. So where does the pressure come from? We'll talk about pressure before next. So the pumping action of the heart generates the pressure, which then generates the flow. So it happens at systole. So the highest blood pressure in the body on the systemic side will be right at the beginning of the aorta. That's where the most pressure is. Now we lose pressure as it overcomes resistance. So the further down the artery we go, the less pressure there is. And by the time we get all the way back to the vena cava, where the vena cava jumps into the right atrium, the pressure is 0. So if systolic blood pressure starts out at 120, by the time it makes it back to the vena cava, it is 0. It takes the whole 120 to overcome and move the blood through the circuit. It looks like this. So one of the things that happens as we get further and further from the heart, the pulse pressure, the difference between the systolic and the diastolic pressure, starts to diminish as there's more and more elastic that maintains the flow, and so the kind of the bumps get smoothed out with distance, and you can see that this drops all the way basically to 0 in the vena cava. So the systolic is because of the pumping of the heart. The diastolic is really because of the elasticity, the distensibility of the arteries. And the systolic is really about the volume of blood forced into the artery at any given time, on each beat. And that's why you can feel a pulse in those elastic arteries. So be careful that you don't mix up systole, the beating of the heart, the contraction of the myocardium, with systolic pressure, which is the blood pressure happening at the time the heart is in systole. The diastolic blood pressure is the blood pressure at the time that the heart is in diastole. The pulse pressure is the difference between the two, the systolic pressure and the diastolic pressure. So if it's 120 over 80, then the pulse pressure is 40. Now, this gets somewhat confusing because the math of it. But really what's happening here is that the heart is in systole only half as long as the heart is in diastole. Basically, if there's a 3 count, one of the counts is systole, and then it goes, and then the other two are diastole. So it goes systole, diastole, diastole, systole, diastole, diastole, systole, diastole, diastole, systole, diastole, diastole. And what this means is that if you want to find the average arterial blood pressure, the mean arterial blood pressure, then you have to take the diastolic pressure into account twice as much as the systolic pressure, because you're in diastole twice as long. So if you take something like 120 over 80, it's 80, 80, 120, 80, 80, 120. So the average is really 80 plus a third of the pulse pressure. So a third of 40 is about 13. So the mean arterial pressure of 120 over 80 is about 93. Now, this is an important thing because when you start to watch people, and as people age, they get what's called hardening of the arteries. There's less elasticity of the arteries, and what happens is the diastolic pressure goes down, and you'll see that the systolic pressure then goes up to compensate. If you calculate the mean arterial pressure, it'll probably come out in the mid-90s. I've done hundreds of patients that I've calculated this on, and it's quite interesting to watch. As the diastolic pressure goes down, the systolic pressure has to go up to compensate. And it has to go up dramatically because you're only in systole half as long as you're in diastole. So when people have hardening of the arteries, they get these huge pulse pressures. So it changes dramatically. One has to be careful because that doesn't mean that the person's hypertensive, even though they have a very high distolic blood pressure. If we were to take an example of somebody, again, with 120 over 80, the difference, the pulse pressure is 40. A third of 40 is 13. 13 plus 80 is 93. And that's what we're actually shooting for. You want mean arterial pressure in the elastic arteries to be someplace in the 90s. But if somebody has a diastolic pressure that has dropped because of hardening of the arteries, because of scar tissue and loss of elastic lamina in their blood vessels, because of cardiovascular disease, because of aging, because of smoking, because of medications, and their diastolic blood pressure drops to 60, then their systolic blood pressure has to go up. So you'll take their blood pressure and you'll get a blood pressure of, say, 160 over 60. Well, 160 over 60 has a difference, has a pulse pressure of 100. A third of 100 is 33, right? 33 plus 60 is 93. So they have the correct mean arterial pressure. Their body is trying to homeostatically compensate for the loss of the diastolic blood pressure by dramatically raising the systolic blood pressure. Now, I'm not saying that this isn't dangerous, because the small blood vessels will rupture or could be damaged by this high systolic blood pressure. But it is the homeostatic way of dealing with it. You have to be careful with the medications that these people are taking. So by the time we get down to the capillaries, by the time we get through all the arterioles, at the arterial end of the capillary bed, the blood pressure is about 35. And it's not, there isn't a systolic and a diastolic anymore. It's the average blood pressure has smoothed right out. So it's about 35. By the time the blood's actually leaving the capillaries and entering the venules, it's down to about 15. And really, that's what you want. You can't have high pressure because the capillaries are too fragile. And you also don't want too much filtration. You don't want too much pressure forcing things out of the capillary beds. So 35 to 15. And it's not between capillary beds, it's over the capillary bed, the arterial end being the higher pressure than the venous end. So as blood collects into the veins, then it starts at about 15. But the lumens keep on getting bigger, and the flow happens because of still the pressure gradients. And resistance is very low because the lumens are bigger, so you don't need that much delta P to maintain the flow. But we aid the flow, and we aid it in a couple of ways. One of the things that happens is that when you take a deep breath, you expand the size of the thorax, and under Boyle's law, therefore, you lower the pressure in the thorax. It's what causes you to inhale. But at the same time, that low pressure in the thorax actually sucks blood towards the thorax in the veins. The other thing that happens is that as your thorax expands, and the pressure drops, the pressure in your abdomen actually goes up, and it squeezes blood back towards the thorax. So that respiratory pump works in a couple of ways, bringing blood back towards the thorax where the heart is located. Another thing that happens is that when you use skeletal muscle, they contract, they'll squeeze blood vessels, and because of the valves, it pushes blood towards the heart. It puts the venous blood under higher pressure while the contraction is happening, and which squeezes the blood towards the heart. Another thing that happens is that if you need more blood to return to the heart, you need to increase cardiac output, then the sympathetic nervous system will actually cause vasoconstriction of the veins a little bit, and that will actually speed up the flow back towards the heart. So this is what the muscular pump looks like. So blood pressure is maintained by the pumping of the heart, by the walls of the blood vessel, and by the kidneys, because the kidneys regulate how much blood there is, and also the kidneys are involved with regulating vasoconstriction through the renin-angiotensin system. All of this is being monitored by the brain. The brain is monitoring blood flow and basically oxygen levels in the various tissues, and responds homeostatically to those imbalances. So the blood pressure is all about cardiac output, peripheral resistance, and the amount of blood. And you can change blood pressure by any of those things. So if somebody has a heart attack, cardiac output goes down, blood pressure drops. If somebody has a massive vasodilation, say from a massive release of histamine in anaphylactic shock, then peripheral resistance goes way down, blood pressure drops. Blood volume adds to it. So if somebody's hemorrhaging, they're losing blood, then there's not enough to maintain the blood pressure, and so blood volume, blood pressure drops. So blood flow in the veins and cardiac output are the exact same uh, formula, so they're dependent on each other. Um, Cardiac output, as we discussed, is determined by how much blood returns to the heart, and so the stroke volume and the heart rate. So all of these things. So if you increase the heart rate and the stroke volume sympathetically, you have you have more pressure. Okay, so if you have, this is an interesting thing, because if you're exercising, that means you have more respiratory pump, you have more muscular pump, and you have more sympathetic venoconstriction. The veins are more constricted, which means you have more venous return, which means you have more end diastolic volume in the heart, which means then you have more stroke volume, which means you have more cardiac output, which then means you have more blood pressure. If a decrease in blood vessel pressure triggers the brain to activate the cardiac centers, then sympathetic activity makes the heart more contractile, which means it pushes more blood out, which means there's less end systolic volume, which then increases the stroke volume, which increases the cardiac output. The epinephrine from that increases contractility, and it increases heart rate. Increased heart rate hormonally with epinephrine, or sympathetically by nerves, increased heart rate increases cardiac output. Decreased parasympathetic activity increases heart rate, which increases cardiac output. All of these things end up meaning higher blood pressure. Blood pressure is controlled in the short term, neurologically and hormonally. So this is the second to second, minute to minute fluctuations in blood pressure. We do it by vasoconstricting, vasodilating, by changing cardiac output, all of those things. It happens because of epinephrine, because of renin, angiotensin, those sorts of things. The long-term control really is about altering how much volume there is in the blood, and that is really from the kidneys. The kidneys regulate that. So the neural controls maintain mean arterial pressure by maintaining blood vessel diameter and altering distribution in response to demands. So, for instance, if you're needing lots of blood going to your skeletal muscle because you are exercising, you're probably not going to send blood to your digestive system at the same time, because you want more to go to the skeletal muscle, etc. There are receptors that are called baroreceptors that monitor blood pressure and feedback, and the walls of the smooth muscle of the blood vessels actually feedback as well. I'm not going to worry about the vasomotor center, but it is it's in the brainstem, in the medulla oblongata. It's related to the cardiovascular center, the cardioacceleratory center, and those sorts of things. So we get baroreceptors in the carotid sinuses, so that's on either side of your neck. It's the ones that you affect when you play the pass-out game. And there's another one in the arch of the aorta. So these are really found, they're stretch receptors found in the walls of these major arteries. The two major arteries going to the brain, the carotids, and the major artery going to everywhere else in the body, the aorta. And they really are stretch receptors that look at blood pressure. So increased blood pressure inhibits and lowers cardiac output, which then feeds back. And this is the homeostatic balance of this. I'm not going to worry about all of this too much, but it basically baroreceptors look at the increased blood pressure, which then goes to the brain, which then decreases the sympathetic, decreases the heart rate, decreases contractility, decreases cardiac output, which then causes vasodilation, which then lowers blood pressure. If it goes the other way, the blood pressure is too low, the baroreceptors respond to that and cause the brain to tell the heart to increase cardiac output, which then, and the blood vessels to constrict, raising blood pressure and normalizing it, so that it works as this double feedback homeostatic mechanism. So these are reflexes. We also look at the chemicals that the blood is carrying, because we need more blood flow if there's something wrong with it. So there are chemoreceptors in the same spot that the baroreceptors are. So they look at too much carbon dioxide or not enough oxygen. Either one will mean that you need more breathing and more blood flow. Because you need more breathing, so you get more ventilation, you need more perfusion, so blood has to follow. Higher brain centers, so this is emotions and thoughts, can regulate it. Your blood pressure can go up when you're angry, for instance. The hormonal mechanisms are very important. There's a couple of them. Epinephrine and norepinephrine come from the adrenal medulla, and they really cause vasoconstriction and increase cardiac output, so they raise blood pressure. There's another important hormone that angiotensinogen, it's an inactive form, is circulating in the blood at all times. When the kidneys release a hormone called renin, it causes a number of chemical reactions that makes angiotensinogen become angiotensin II. I don't care about all the steps, but angio means blood vessel, tension means contraction. So it causes vasoconstriction, which increases blood pressure, and this is really regulated by the kidneys. There is a hormone that's released by the heart in response to high blood pressure. When the right atrium senses that there's too much blood coming back to the heart, it releases a hormone called ANP, atrial natriuretic peptide, and that means it's a protein made by the atrium of the heart that causes sodium in the urine. It makes your pee salty. So what it ends up doing is makes you have less blood, so it lowers blood pressure. Another very important hormone is one that comes from the pituitary gland at the base of the brain, and it's called antidiuretic hormone, and it makes you not pee. Diuresis is to produce urine, anti is against, so it makes you not pee. And it makes you not pee, it increases the amount of blood volume, so your blood pressure goes up. Now, these two things also cause vasodilation and vasoconstriction as kind of secondary things. But so the vasoconstriction from the antidiuretic hormone actually raises blood pressure. So you'll see that there are four hormones that regulate blood pressure. Three of them raise your blood pressure, which are the norepinephrine and epinephrine, the angiotensin, and the antidiuretic hormone. And there's one that lowers blood pressure, which is the atrial natriuretic peptide. Long-term regulation of blood pressure is really involved with anything that helps you find a homeostatic balance of your blood pressure, and it really is the kidneys that do it. The kidneys are the most important organ to blood pressure in the short term and in the long-term mechanisms. So the problem with the short-term mechanisms is that they adapt quickly, and so you need to have things that overcome that adaptation. The baroreceptors in the walls of the blood vessels, you don't want them to adapt. So the kidneys will directly and indirectly regulate blood pressure. So the direct mechanism is that increased blood pressure causes more filtration to happen at the kidneys, which means that there is less reabsorption at the kidneys, so you make more urine, and you have less liquid, so therefore less blood pressure. It's as simple as that. If you have peeing more, your blood pressure goes down because you have less liquid. So if your blood pressure is low, then what happens is you have slower filtration at the kidneys, which means there's more time to reabsorb water at the kidneys, so you end up peeing less, and you have more blood volume, which then raises blood pressure. The indirect method I've already alluded to. This is the renin-angiotensin. So decreased blood pressure means that the kidneys release renin. Renin causes the production of angiotensin 2. Angiotensin 2 vasoconstricts, and angiotensin 2 causes the adrenal gland to release aldosterone. Aldosterone causes you to reabsorb more sodium. Reabsorbing more sodium causes more osmosis, which means you reabsorb more water, which means you have less urine, and your blood pressure goes up. And angiotensin 2 stimulates the pituitary gland to release antidiuretic hormone, which causes you to reabsorb more water at the kidneys, which means that you will have your blood pressure go up. So it all seems to come back to the kidneys, even through the antidiuretic hormone. Bring it all together. So increased activity in the muscular pump. Respiratory pump means increased venous return, which means increased stroke volume, which increases cardiac output, which increases blood pressure. Release of atrial natriuretic peptide means that you put more. If you decrease the atrial natriuretic peptide, you reabsorb more sodium, which means that there's more osmosis, more blood volume, which increases venous return, which increases stroke volume, which increases cardiac output, which increases blood pressure. If you lose fluid, hemorrhage, sweating, that kind of thing, you decrease blood volume, which then affects the baroreceptors, which activates the vasomotor centers, which increases heart rate, which increases stroke volume, which increases cardiac output. It also decreases blood vessel diameter, which increases peripheral resistance, which increases blood pressure. If you have high body temperature, it decreases pH, decreases oxygen, increases carbon dioxide, which is the chemoreceptors, etc. ends up increasing blood pressure. If you have the hormones, antidiuretic hormone, norepinephrine, angiotensin, it decreases blood vessel diameter, which then increases resistance, which increases blood pressure. If you have dehydration, you have less plasma, which means more viscosity, which means more resistance, which then means more pressure. If you get fat, body size increases, which increases blood vessel length, which increases resistance, which increases pressure. All of these things are somehow balanced in the homeostasis of every individual. And some of them change rapidly, some of them change slowly. When one thing goes up, then other things go down to compensate, and can lead to a lot of different pathologies. This is why body size, obesity, is related to heart disease. This is why dehydration and such all are related